just before, my text has named Homonymic Curtain. And just before I finished it, some months ago, I found this, I remind myself to the song, Czech song written by Jiří Suchý in 1963. I had this project of 1963, and some of you maybe will see it in the gallery during your Bratislava's visit. And I have a quotation or several lines of the lyrics translated by my friend John Minehane, who translated poetry into a poetry, so I will read it first. The song is sang by Hanna Hegerova, so those who are Czech here, you know it's Mého života. So it's from the middle of the song. They drew my human profile, traced it and retraced, though the main thing escaped them, how I look face to face. Then come the resolution to correct past wrongs. But please bear in mind that the years have gone along. I'm standing here today and I'm another man. And then song continues and so. During the discussion after one of the lectures at the 45th conference of the AICA in Zurich last year, some speakers, and I may mention Henry Merrick Hughes, called for critics to address the fact that the art history of Central and Eastern Europe is not designated as a unified system, and accordingly it is not clear how it relates to the written Euro-American art history, codified as a whole only from a Western angle of vision. The present paper is, I try to be polite, so the present paper is intended to be kind of reply, even it took me 1 year to do it, so, but better than never. The art of Central Europe is like a Rubik cube, connected as a whole, but with various colored walls, while relationships within and between the individual colors are complicated and shifting, depending on which section we are trying to assemble and which side we are looking from. In this study, I look at post-war art from the Slovak side, where the main factor is simply the preponderance of its own avant-garde. This has its advantages, a freer model for reflection, and disadvantages also, restricted validity of application to the bordering art scenes. In Slovakia, we have a habitual tendency to see the period from 1948 as an ambiguously discontinuous rupture and the 1960s as a return to common ideals at the summit of European modernism. Is this, however, the only possible reading? In replying to this question, I want to pose the alternative of seeing the post-war period as unified throughout all Europe. Instead of the concept of rupture, in a transferred sense, I want to use the new concept of the homonymic curtain, whose first manifestations I see precisely at the beginning of 1960s, when similar artistic forms on both sides of the Iron Curtain were not merely adopted and sustained, but simultaneously generated new forms and different significances. For this attempt, I have chosen a common denominator, one simplifying but universal and indubitable fact, the politics of renewal, which was common to all Europe in the post-war years. This was a quotation by the book Art After 1900. I have summarized the argument as a work in progress in the following 8 theses. Můžeš mi dát ten můj pohár, prosím tě, čo je tam pohár? Sorry. Thesis number 1. In the post-1945 period the greater part of Western and Eastern Europe represents, from the humanistic standpoint, a shared mental space, whose denominator is, apart from widespread revulsion at the war just ended, also the ideology of renewal. The moment when World War II ends, as a common all-European paradigm, may be perceived as the historical index of climactic modernism, which had been the decisive factor either directly or in its consequences for the next 15-20 years. Renewal was a political instrument which had differing connotations and consequences in a variety of countries. But aside from radical political attitudes, it was the common denominator of post-war humanism, deriving precisely from this renewal, which led many individuals from left-wing intellectual circles to an initial, though mostly brief, acceptance of the socialist realist doctrine of the Soviet bloc just then being established. If we train this light upon Boris Groys's well-known remarks that socialist art, and this is somehow kind of my comment to what Tomasz was saying, I'm quoting, the socialist art is not just an organic continuation of the Russian avant-garde, but in a certain sense also its culmination, end of the quotation. It follows that in the case of East Central Europe, whose avant-gardes had a different diapason and as compared with the Russian, there was only a formal echo, literally an imitation of what Groys calls soc-realist art. The fact that the East Central European variant of socialist realism, came to the fore at the time when the center of real artistic production lay somewhere else, may be accounted for mainly by the post-war resistance of earlier avant-garde ideals, the attempt to reconnect with them and at the same time build on them was a distinctive memorial mark of cultural renewal. The initial Czechoslovak soc-realist praxis was projected into this avant-gardist context. It was only potentially acceptable because it was mistakenly comprehended as an attitude towards or answer to the intricate questions about the direction of the world. Indeed, one can say that in this sense it was seen for a while as an intellectual challenge. In 1950s, as Piotr Piotrowski says, it was even the case that Polish modernism was open towards socialist realism. In our case, however, there was only a brief latency phase preceding a generally enforced realism of depiction, which gradually convinced the majority of artists that they had overrated the artistic potential of socialist realism. Even if we see all this through Groys's reflection on continuity, since indoctrination too may be seen as an expression of a higher continuity, the fact remains irrefutable that socialism and the avant-garde in Central Europe are contradictory. Socialism, in our context, did not develop as a certain stage in a progress of complex cultural political evolution. Rather, it was enforced as a ready-to-hand instrument of totality. Apart from this, rejection of its link with the avant-garde in our milieu is reinforced by the literalness, illustrativeness, unsureness about the rules, and retarded movement into 19th century direction, all factors of discontinuity. So kind of conclusion of the first thesis. One can therefore say that in East Central Europe, socialist realism in its fundamental sense made no appearance. Even despite the first phase of acceptance round about 1948, we must speak rather of obligatory works kowtowing to socialist morphology and thus differentiate between the concept of socialist art, in a Groys sense, and the socialist genre. In any case, despite the quantitative dominance of the socialist genre, authentic artistic production, which today forms the official history of art, was sustained in the sphere of completely different problems. Thesis number 2. The shared mental space, contemporary and memorial, in which various worldviews had hitherto contended discursively, was not lost with the waving of a magic wand sometime around 1948. It was simply that shared ideals of the further direction of modern avant-garde art were suddenly developing in different political conditions on the opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. For those countries which afterwards found themselves on its eastern side, the first 3 post-war years had decisive significance for securing shared European pre-war memory. Activity from 1945 to 1948 period continued for many years as a source of ideas and a yardstick for the most up-to-date work. Later, it represented a time of free access to various styles of European art, for example, through an intensive transit of exhibition before the definitive closing of borders and restriction of the flow of information. Piotr Piotrowski emphasizes above all the role of Picasso's Cubism, Surrealism and Constructivism. It is precisely these which he sees as having the crucial influence in post-war Central Europe. Equally, in the 1960s, Jindřich Chalupecký developed his fundamental ideas from a criticism of post-war surrealism. Conclusion: the restricted flow of information through the Iron Curtain after 1948 did not change the nature of culture in the Eastern European milieu. One might rather say that here, in the sense of basic premises, there was conservation of the parameters, maybe ideals, of the cultural situation between 1945 and 1948. Thesis number 3. Despite the fact that various forms of abstraction can be regarded as the dominant post-war art of Western Europe, in the United States they even acquired the status of official state representation, on both sides of the Iron Curtain there was a trend towards producing ideologically heightened art genres with effective mass dissemination. If we ignore a few dyed-in-the-wool artistic ideologues, there were never any artists of quality in Czechoslovakia, except for the already mentioned brief initial period, who felt inner identification with the socialist genre. Quantitatively, it was rather the domain of the less talented or the opportunists. In the USA, the production of capitalist realism reflected the rules of the market, while the majority of customers were regular readers of magazines where such works were reproduced. The free arts took off on quite different paths. Both these situations are therefore not essentially different. Neither official nor market art was ever the entirety of art. Tomáš Pospíšil has, in the mentioned book, Comparative Studies, analyzed the differences between the realisms of Norman Rockwell and Russian painter Fyodor Reshetnikov. He pointed to Rockwell's distaste for abstraction and inclination towards kitsch, but he praised his caricaturist talent and his optimism, which nowadays, through the smoothed-down frontiers of high and low art, may be read as a neutral historical references. By contrast, he considers the painting of socialist realism in general as illustrations of the political history of quotation, political history of totalitarian regimes, end of quotation. The ex-post reduction of the capitalist realist genre to a historical reference is from the comfort of today a clear-cut result. But it is also valid for the socialist genre, since the motivations of that time have ceased to be current on both sides of the Iron Curtain after the latter's fall. But one must not forget the projective quality of these works and their falsely idyllic spirit, which did not have to correspond with reality, a fact that may compromise their neutrality. We can take the thought about neutrality one step further. The putative historical reference of official art in Central Europe of 1950s becomes a pure simulacrum precisely on account of the above mentioned imitation of socialist art in its genre form. Conclusion. In considering the similarity of cultural praxis on the opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, we must separate the hegemonic positions of the USA and the Soviet Union from Europe, West and East, which did not copy the models presented in any thoroughgoing fashion. A further factor serving to test two realisms has less to do with their authentic time and more with their present-day application. Today we see socialist realism always from a critical detachment. In the case of capitalist realism, more weight has been given to the historical value as pointing toward the present day, which it meanwhile acquired. But these realisms have in common the fact that in neither case was there any genuinely lasting culture-creating phenomenon. Thesis number 4. Let us compare the mechanism of the original non-acceptance of the alternative artistic direction or artistic program in the West with the Eastern non-exhibition of art which creative an alternative to the obligatory canon. If we look at this comparison from the institutional standpoint, one can then say that the functional principles of art in both East and West in the 1950s had a mutual correlation. As Maria Orišková says, the myth of the avant-garde artist, with all its features of heroism, tragedy, and utopia, is not remote from the characteristics of the avant-garde artists in the West. Apart from institutional reasons, we may also find artistic reasons. One was their common points of departure. Besides knowledge of the development of artistic modernism, there was also the shared question of revitalization of the avant-gardes in the years 1945 and 1948. A second reason was the permeability of information, sometimes only visual, through the borders of individual states during the Cold War, and also the existing contacts of the artists. I want to emphasize the processual character of this situation, that it was not just an episode, but rather a long enduring state or experience. So first is an outstanding example of immanent avant-garde continuities, the activity of Vladimír Boudník from the late 1940s. Again, Tomáš Pospíšil has written about Pravoslav Rada's contacts with Asger Jorn and the Cobra movement in the mid-1950s. Likewise, Piotr Petrovský on Ernst Schröder contacts and the residence of Jerzy Kujawski and others in Paris. This theme could certainly be refined by comparing the strategies of further individuals of movements. It may suffice to mention the initial rejection of the new post-war work by Jean Dubuffet in Paris, or the non-comprehension of Barnett Newman's work in the early 1950s in New York. For our purposes, it is enough to stress the most important point that one cannot speak of complete severance between East and West, or a basic restructuring, official versus alternative or non-exhibited, of the art scenes. Second point, each particular country had a number of periodicals devoted to contemporary or older or pre-modern art. The paradox that each of the countries of the socialist bloc had different priorities in art and a differently orientated censorship, together with the fact that the post-Stalin thaw took its course everywhere at a different time, had the following results. If we gather a selection of the given publications, we hit upon various forms of the seepage of information. Besides, Western periodicals too turned up in the libraries. Access to them was admittedly restricted, but not impossible. One could mention also the hotly pursued monographs of Western artists. This is the thing that Beata Jablonska told me after she found Francis Bacon book in Academy of Fine Arts library in Bratislava, purchased in the beginning of 1960s. The connection of East and West was therefore not completely severed. In this thesis hitherto, I have indicated that the rupture of cultural history after 1948 is in a certain sense open to question, and above all, having regard to non-existence of Central European socialism in its consequent form, as I mentioned in thesis number 1, having regard to the impossibility of cutting of common breeding around the cultural milieu in thesis number 2, and furthermore, by contrast, without regard to the different ideological backgrounds of the similarly prominent mass art on both sides of the Iron Curtain in thesis number 3. Hence also in the comparable, in a certain sense, institutional standing of incipient artistic alternatives in a similarly structured scenes. Thesis number 5. In due course, the continuum of artistic praxis up to the end of 1950s, for example, the passage of a whole decade in different condition in East and West, began to show evidence of differences in the significance of related artistic forms, that is to say, the emergence of what I call homonymic curtain. Many of the studies hitherto on questions of the relationship of the art of West and East are founded on a time shift from the emergence of some style in its place of origin to its gradual resonance in more distant parts, and most often the track leads from the West to East. Hans Belting indeed had written that East European art in relation to the art of the West was for the most part a latecomer. This overview is historically justified in the case of older art, but one needs to look differently at the situation after 1948. Inspiration of whatever kind which had been elaborated outside its own milieu not only took on, but subsequently further generated different meanings and connections. Even the first circle, works bearing, e.g. for contextual reasons, a different significance, may pose problems in their use in terminology of Western art history. But for the second circle, works or tendencies generated in reactions to the first circle, use of those terminologies may be literally treacherous, even in cases of formal resemblances, in either a contemporary or retroactive sense. A good example, though certainly not the only one, is the Central European informal, which represented politicized abstraction revolting against the obligatory socialist figurative genre, as Piotrowski, among others, writes. This at the time when informal in France and abstraction similarly in the USA was exposed to a new avant-garde critique. By the end of the 1950s, the efforts of a post-war European renewal were drawing to an end, while the later retardation of the socialist countries was not yet apparent. Proof of that, certainly, was the Brussels Expo in 1958, which was the first post-war encounter of the rivals in the Cold War. The fact that the Czechoslovak pavilion won the Grand Prix was confirmation of the extra-official strivings of artists and the art industry in Czechoslovakia. Particularly interesting in 50 years of modern art, an exhibition held in Brussels on the occasions of the fair. The manner in which the exhibition was composed at the given time is exceptionally significant. The concept was simple. Against the background of the style categories of the Western history of art, it showed the chronology of the development of modern art by an international yardstick. An outstanding selection summarized the most important works of modernism from the end of the 19th century. For the purposes of this essay, however, the most interesting chapter is that devoted to works produced after 1948, West European and East European, American and Soviet. And in that context, the plurality of representation is surprising, as if the rules of capitalist competition had been extended to the artistic field and had overcome the incompatibility of the artistic conceptions which I am writing about in this chapter. That is to say, American abstract expressionism met Soviet socialist realism in the same exhibition. This moment of open encounter was underlined also by the International Commission with the Soviet and American representation. What was the portent of such a moment of artistic content? For the representatives of Central Europe, it was above all the chance of at least formally distancing oneself from the backward culture dogma of the Soviet Union by declaring one's adherence to modernism. The factor of global contest required, on the one hand, progressive presentation, and also, in the case of a common exhibition, contextual presentation, making reference to the pre-war successes of works by, from Czech Republic, Václav Špála and Josef Šíma. In contradiction to the Soviet pavilion, it was shown that what was being done in the art scenes in the satellite countries was not so much subjected to Soviet pressure as in the case of media censorship. The residual compatibility of socialist and capitalist countries in the field of culture and industry likewise confirms that one cannot validly regard this period as one of rupture. Wojciech Láhoda has identified the influence which the Brussels Expo 1958, left on the Czech art scene in terms of formal stylization of the object of abstraction. Turning, however, to František Hudeček, Jan Kotík, Jindřich Vilgus, Zdeněk Palcer, and others, he aptly dates the sources of this reflection as far back as decade before Brussels. And now it's longer quotation. The Brussels style of elegant modernity in sculpture was confirmation of the round or geometrical modernization of form that had been sought. It was something that related to the important personalities in modern sculpture and was a live issue prior to Brussels. In short, something had been in the air even before the exhibition. End of quotation. In the context of this essay, I would rather say that this was still the common air from the past. One must admit, however, that the air proceeding from a common breeding ground of thoughts and maintaining common ideals was already beginning to blow upon another operational structure, newly opened and established during 1950s. Let us simply compare the dynamically developing market and institutions, the flourishing criticism and alternative post-Bauhaus forms of education, including articulation of the modernist discourse in the West, with the centralization of older and newly emerged institutions and the replacement of the real market by the state commissions in the East. Even that, however, need not of itself suffice for a homonymic curtain to come into being. What most promoted that development was the non-existence of any relevant framework of a more universal kind for the specific situation of contemporary art in Eastern Bloc, whether ideological or not. I am not saying that the texts of Western art theory and criticism were not reflected at the moment, but in the sense of direct reactions to them and discussions with them, even with those that were Marxist, no alternative existed on the other side of the Iron Curtain. In that period, the art of the Eastern Bloc became a satellite of a theoretical framework with which it identified through its unexhibited work and through the intellectuals, but in which it could not participate on equal terms. Reliance on Western theory and critical models without immediate reflection on the specificity of one's own present time within their context began at variance with the intentions of critics and theorists to deepen the differences in significance between Western and Eastern art production. Logically, it follows from this that even one-sided reference to Western critical models resulted only in further divergences. This is number 6. Despite politically different development, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the art scenes matured to recognition of the need to get beyond post-war art. One striking influence of this was the presence of a numerous post-war generation coming to adulthood precisely at the end of 1950s. This was a social force whose ideas and tastes could not have been ignored by any political regime. The triumph of a pop culture may be observed almost everywhere in the world, but the criticism of it by pop art or situationism played an important role in Western art. While criticism of consumerism of American society and the elitism of abstract art was heard in Czechoslovakia at the moment, and you could read it in newspapers, this was nonetheless not known by experience from the Eastern point of view. The critical and subversive aspect of pop art was indeed identified, but in our case, the targets of its criticism represented something else besides their real equivalents. Viewed from behind the Iron Curtain, consumerism and advertising were in reality perceived as attractive counterweights to the greyness of socialism. Almost all the conquests of contemporary art in Czechoslovakia of 1960s can be ascribed to the credit to the youngest generation of artists, which easily become enthused by new forms through they did not necessarily or could not comprehend them fully in context, and so as a rule they outgrew them after their own manner in a very short time. For our study of the history of instances where Slovak art turned to international models, the most important issue is how and when the mainly young artists emancipated themselves from the given inspiration. The art of negation thus began to play a fundamental role in the defining the current expression of the art of 1960s. In the common confrontation, thesis number 7. In the common confrontation of the art of West and East in Czechoslovakia shortly before the mid-1960s, the idea emerged of reconnecting with activity that had been broken off in the year 1948. Certainly, one can speak of Central European linking up with the neo-avant-garde and the renewal of international communication. But the new confrontation of West and the East and the sharing of information on the forms which the neo-avant-gardes generated had already entered into the frameworks of differently constructed milieu, and those in turn influenced the given forms and how they were read in different ways. In this connection, one needs to be aware that the socialist society in Czechoslovakia, by virtue of its continued existence, gradually became normal during the period of post-Stalinist thaw. With the subsequent slackening of the censorship of art, it eventually began to proclaim itself as democratizable, a process which culminated rapidly in the spring and summer of 1968, of course. In Slovakia, manifestations of the homonymic curtain were principally to be found in the art of informal, reflections of pop art and neorealism, new figuration, conceptualism, and neo-constructivism. This is kind of, now it's this example I would try to prove the thing, and it will be just one more page. Slovak informal can be considered, apart from an interest in abstraction, as a reflection of an hostile attitude to the obligatory dogmas of the socialist art in Central Europe. Those whom it captivated around 1959 and 1960 were above all the youngest, then rebellious, generation of students and fresh graduates from the Academy of Fine Arts who did not give unqualified acceptance to abstractions, but found there a valuable connecting bridge towards their own later authentic artistic programs. In the past, we considered their modes of entry into their own artistic contexts as a typical instance of syncretism, because, for example, we see pop art tendencies in relation to informal as contradictory. However, this is a topic that can be further unfolded. The non-acceptance of abstraction in its philosophical essence could assist in specifically preparing the Slovak art scene to accept new, hitherto unexpected stimuli. In that way, we can also read the above-mentioned syncretism, fusions of the aesthetics of elite, informal, and popular neorealism, as a critical attitude towards the elitism of art, and in further sequence it may be seen as a prefiguring the later conceptualist critique of art as such. Simultaneously, it also could be a distinctive program of settling accounts with a different perception and significance of left-wing thinking in the West and in Czechoslovakia. One of the vehicles for syncretism of informal in 1960-1964 was the portrayal of the figure. Its residual post-Cubist form from the later Bratislava confrontations had been gradually lost to the benefit of purely abstract structural graphics. But then, subsequently, from the 0 point, the figure made its return, and a painter and sculptor's variant of new figuration arose from surface, texture, or assemblage. In this connection, one can go to say that Slovak conceptualism, whose foreshadowing we can date from the turn of years 1963 and 64, emerged from the collision with pop art as an expression of socially active and critical art towards our own traditional artistic milieu. We can therefore deduce that its path was presaged by the very discovery of abstraction, geometry, and the letter in our painting from 1960, which evoked a need to respond to specific social questions and the associations they touched on. What eventually produced an answer to these questions was the influence of neorealism, which in our context, as I have already argued in print, in a short time represented both the avant-garde and neo-avant-garde together, in the sense of their ideals. Do we need to emphasize yet again that the reading of the above-mentioned artistic trends, which is customary in the West, will not do for them in our context? In response to what has been said, one may search for the point where the concept of homonymic curtain first becomes functional, because even in his sketchy account it is clear that the projection of Western tendencies into other contexts of the Eastern milieu is far less important than their subsequent operation and outgrowing to the point of rejection. What concerns me here is to identify the active functions in these contexts, not their passive givens. It is only by finding keys for defining the different significance of forms that are similar, or indeed congruent, that we can understand the true logic of the appearance and career of the neo-avant-garde in our milieu. This is number 8, and it's the shortest one. This is number 8. From the possibility of seeing the significances of similarly sounding works of the late 1950s in the West and East differently, I derived the paradox that the real divorce of Western and Eastern modernism was not played around 1948, but rather at the time when the notion emerged of their relinking through the meeting or collision or kindred similar forms with a different developmental diagram, ergo, by then with a different meaning. The confrontation of Western and Eastern art through exhibitions or written catalogue in its time did not take account of the relevant difference of significances. A formal compatibility was welcomed as the return of the prodigal son. This distorted perspective was reinforced by the transit of a number of educated and influential Western critics, whose viewpoint today raises the question whether essentially colonial approaches are not being applied. The homonymic curtain may be a convenient auxiliary method for further reflections of parallel two-voiced histories by Belting, responsible for differing local mental conditions by Baxendale, of the living cultural heritage of the particular cultural situation, once the opening decade of the socialist regimes in Central Europe had run its course. Becoming aware, just a 5 slides conclusion, becoming aware of the fact that the homonymic curtain exists may help us, assuming that the topic is further developed, to come closer to answering the question, why is that despite enthusiasm at the return of 1960s and the 1990s also, the discourse of Central European art has hitherto been superimposed by the art history formulated in the West, focused only on individuals and not on specific scenes or tendencies. Thank you very much. No question.
doesn't matter. Thank you, Richard, for your deconstruction and reconstruction art history in 8 steps. Yes, it's very inspiration. And now we have space for some questions, 1 or 2, because we are a little bit late. Nobody? Yes.
It was a response to you, so.
Thank you very much, Richard, for a very carefully differentiated argument. I would only just a very quick comment by way of addition. It's almost too late for us as Europeans to start looking at the space that you describe, because we've been overtaken, as I implied before, by a new kind of globalization. But we have to remember, and you are remembering what you're saying, that in Europe, above all in all of Europe, we share the heritage of the Enlightenment, and it's the heritage of the capitalist and of course of the socialist ideologies. And even between those two contrasting poles, there's the third way represented by Yugoslavia, if you like, but also by the Scandinavian spaces and by the other peripheries of Europe. So, I mean, I very much support the argument that you're putting forward, and underneath that there is a fundamental ideological unity and sort of intellectual history which we all share, which we've exported to the world at large and re-imported in different forms. And of course, Europe itself has become the fractured mirror of that, those messages that we've sent out.
Thank you. I noticed this was kind of shortcut in many different points inside the text. So